Welcome back. You made it to the final section of the program. This is regarding performance improvement. And let's face it, that's really what these programs are really all about. If we're not improving the performance of our program over time, then why are we meeting at these meetings? Like I said, I've probably alluded to this all along. I'm not a big fan of sitting in meetings unless we're accomplishing things. If we're accomplishing something and we're improving, I'm all for it. But I don't need to sit into another meeting and listen to a lot of people talk about what we could be doing. I'd rather be talking about what we are doing. And I think you're probably at this point now too. If you've stuck it out this long, or if you jumped ahead and went right to performance improvement section of the program, hang in there. We've got some more information for you, and I think you're going to like it. So I put this together a few years ago. It was really just my observations, and it was kind of there's so many different types of PI programs out there. It doesn't matter if you're looking at, Lean or the Toyota method or the DMAIC or any of these, PDSA. There's tons of ways to improve practice. And I really just kind of distilled it down to 10 steps, which I found myself repeating over and over again. It's not that the other ways of doing this are any less important. In fact, actually, they're a lot more established. It's just the way that I ended up doing it. But I'll describe it, and you're probably going to find that this is just in keeping in line with everything else you've seen in terms of performance improvement. But the first thing is establish the baseline. When you get your program, find out what your baseline is. If you've been up and running and you haven't really been paying attention to it, if there's some way to go back and pull data and look at it, find out what your baseline is. Even if it's something like turnover time or total case time or average cost of a benign hysterectomy, it doesn't matter. Pick something and establish the baseline. Once you establish a baseline, if you have the ability to do it, and you can look in a risk-adjusted manner, and you can get some kind of benchmarking, by all means do it. I think that's a great way to start looking at your program. Even if you can't do that, with your baseline, you could start using that as your benchmark. And going forward, you want to improve on that. But if you have access to some of these more sophisticated statistical programs out there and these types of analyses that give you not only risk adjustment, but also benchmarking across the country, more power to you. That's going to, I think, definitely play to your advantage. You get a sense of where you stand compared to the rest of the country, and you want to know, first thing is where do we need to focus on? Because you can't fix it all at the same time. Everybody's going to want you to. Like I said, everybody's going to have a different agenda. Everybody's going to have different expectations. And unfortunately, what happens a lot of times is people get caught up in the anecdote. Last week we had a case, and I had that happen to me one time where someone came and said, we had this case, and it was a terrible outcome, and we got to do something. We have to do something about it. I went back and I started looking at the case, and then I started looking at our data, and I said, as a program, we really don't have a problem there. Actually, we're doing really exceptionally well. We had one case. But unfortunately, what happened was that one case became sort of the driver of we've got to make this better. And it's like, okay, we had to work it through our peer review program rather than our formal program for doing this. And so I think you got to be careful of that. Try not to try to improve on things based on anecdote. There's nothing wrong with anecdote. Like I said, anecdote is a good way of getting a sensitivity of what's going on out there. So you'll get a lot of people approaching you saying we have to work on this. But data is going to help you really get down to what must we work on. Even if it's this anecdotal stuff, if you may find yourself getting caught up in, focus on the things that you really, really see a problem in and really getting some answers for, and then how to go about fixing it. So establishing a baseline, getting some type of benchmarking is a good way to do that. It gives you, I always felt, even with administrative data, it gives you directional information. Administrative data doesn't give you a lot of the fine-tuning that I would have expected. Your clinical databases are much better at doing that, but I think it's directional information. It'll give you an idea, is it complications, and if so, what kinds of categories of complications should we be looking at? And so it gives you a reasonably good idea of a starting point. But once you do that, you get your benchmarking, you identify your opportunity. And let's just say, for example, you notice that you had a higher than expected rate of complications with your robotically assisted colectomies. And you want to figure out, how do we approach this? The next step, which is an often overlooked step, which is attribution analysis. And what you really have to do is look at your program and start looking at your data. And if you have, let's say you have, 6 surgeons who are doing these cases. That'd probably be a lot for most programs. Well, let's just say you had 6 surgeons who were doing it. Is it one surgeon that's bringing everybody else out of line, or is it all 6 that are having an issue? Because if it's all 6, there's more likely a system level issue happening. And you see this a lot with programs that do not have enhanced recovery. Programs that have enhanced recovery usually can tighten up those scores pretty well. If you don't have enhanced recovery programs at your hospital, I would strongly endorse it. I think they're great programs. I've been a big advocate of this for years now. We did a study and demonstrated improved outcomes with that. So I'm supportive of it. But I'm using it as an example because that's what my experience has been. Attribution analysis demonstrated to us that we really didn't find any one surgeon who was really sort of the outlier, or even a group that was really the outlier. What we found was it was pretty much a symmetric bell-shaped curve across the entire organization. What we did find, though, which is interesting, was we found some outliers who were outliers in a positive fashion. And we looked at their practice and found out that they were using enhanced recoveries, and that was how it really drove us to use that as a system-based practice. But identify the attribution, because if it's just one person, then you can focus on that one person, or if it's just one team or one area that's having a problem, you can focus on that. But if it looks like you can't really pin your finger on anything, there's pretty good evidence there that that's probably something that happened at the system level. And there's nothing wrong with it. System level problems actually are nice ones to tackle, because once you fix them, it fixes it at a big level, meaning a lot of people are impacted by that change. I then go into evidence-based medicine, meaning I've identified the opportunity. I think I know where the problem is and what type of problem it is. I then look at the evidence in the literature and ask myself, has anybody else run into this before, and what are they doing? And that was where we started reading more and more about enhanced recovery and really defined a program for our organization that ended up working. Practice-based evidence is another way. I alluded to it before, and that is that we saw these positive outliers, and the question really was, what are they doing different? And what we found was they figured out ways to integrate enhanced recovery into their practice, because not a lot of people were supportive of it. They even had partners that were not supportive of it, and so they had to figure out, how do I make sure that my patients always get enhanced recovery programs? And it was interesting. So we went to them and watched what they were doing and realized we could probably do this across the entire system. And we were able to do that. So I like practice-based evidence because somebody else has identified the problem, they figured out a solution, and you just have to figure out how to take their solution and scale it up to the entire organization. So it's a nice one. The plan and do part is sitting down and saying, okay, now that we identify what the problem is, we think we know what the solution is, how are we going to distribute this knowledge across the entire organization? How are we going to hardwire that into our practice? And I have a book and also a series of discussions on this. You can go to my website and check it out. It's under the clinical practice program, but it goes into a lot more definition of what I mean by this. But the idea of, how do you implement this across a system in a way that you can get results? How can you demonstrate improved process, and how do you demonstrate improved outcome? Because I think that's really, really important. You have to look at process measures. Donna Beating, back in 1966, wrote just an absolute classic paper on structure, process, and outcome, and said you really can't separate them. Structure is really sort of the context in which you're trying to develop a change. The process is the specific step that you're going to do. So for us in enhanced recovery, it was early ambulation. We defined that as ambulating patients a minimum of 3 times a day, at least 25 feet in the halls on post-op day 1. That was a pretty simple definition. We also included early alimentation, which was having patients drink a minimum of 200 cc's of liquids on post-op day 1, something we could track. That's a process measure. We then went back after several months and started looking at outcome measures. And lo and behold, what we identified was we started seeing a statistically significant drop in improvement in performance. So we saw about a 28% drop in overall complications, about a 34% drop in pulmonary complications, and equally as much in GI complications, particularly postoperative ileus. So great outcomes as a result of some simple process measures that we implemented. And then we standardized, and then we went back and we put this into our order sets. We started looking at it in terms of a practice that nurses can incorporate on a daily basis. It was really just an absolute great experience. But you can do this exact same thing for your robotics program. It doesn't have to be just necessarily enhanced recovery. You can do it with any type of practice. But the idea is to identify what the practice is and start working through this list of these 10 steps. I think if you follow this, you're going to have success. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice first. But once you get good at it, it's actually relatively, I want to say it's always easy. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult than other times, but it's always rewarding when you get there, when you see the outcomes. And for me, I just, when I first saw our outcomes, I was just ecstatic. And you can see I'm probably a kind of pretty low-key person, and I'm not really, bumping all over the place and, hooting and hollering and stuff. But that's how I felt. And in fact, actually, that was what I ended up doing. I was in a hotel when I got the results, and my wife came running in. She says, "What's the matter?" And she said, "I've never seen you this happy since our wedding night." And I said, "This is great stuff," And she's like, "Oh, wow, okay, great." And but I was just genuinely just pleased with the results, and it's to me it's just one of those times when you really need to reward yourself, reward your team, and then move on and do it in another area. Performance improvement, I'm a big believer in this, and you can use whatever type of acronym you want, but SMART goals to me is just a pretty simple one. And it's a way of identifying not only your goals, but how to create them. They have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they have to be achievable, they have to be realistic, and they have to be time-bound. And so I gave an example with this enhanced recovery. I was telling you what we ended up doing was we defined ambulating a minimum of 3 times on post-op day 1, 25 feet or more. And so what we did is we did have some help with our clinical informatics folks. We had an electronic medical record, and what we did is we were able to collect that data. So it's measurable. We knew we could collect data. Nurses would go in, they'd check a tab if the patients achieved that, and once they achieved that, that counted for our program. It was measurable. We can look at it. It was very specific. There was no doubt about what we meant by ambulation. It was achievable. We already knew that we were doing this about 40% of the time and really wanted to improve on that. We knew it was realistic. We knew getting patients and ambulating was not a big, difficult problem. In fact, actually, the very first reference I could find was, I think it was like back in 1899 in the Annals of Surgery. It was demonstrated the improved outcomes of following ambulation following abdominal surgery. I was like, holy cow, man. We found data, we found literature over 100 years old, and we're still trying to get people up and moving after an operation. Well, as it turns out, it was good back then, and it's really good right now. We had a time-bound, meaning we had a time period under which we wanted to achieve a certain performance, and we were able to beat our stretch targets for that year and the following year when we did that as a system-wide program. So it's really kind of nice to be able to do that. But I learned from that, which is you got to really set these up as SMART goals. If you don't, you're setting yourself up for failure. You may look at it and go like, well, we'll just set a goal. We're going to improve outcomes. We're going to decrease complications. Well, without a specific plan and without something that supports it, it's going to be very difficult to achieve those outcomes. So you have to remember, be specific. Be set up as SMART goals. So level of performance, always a controversy. Where do you start looking at your level of performance? And this is why I go back to that whole thing of, set your baseline. Identify baselines for all of this stuff, and then ask yourself, if you can get data that demonstrates that you're an outlier in one or more areas, that's where you focus on. It's a lot easier to get people to focus on things that are more system, facility-based and operating room. When you start getting down to the surgeon level and team level, it starts getting a little personal. And when you're first starting your program, I would probably not go out and start picking on your surgeons. And you're going to see this thing with how we pick our metrics, how we start with metrics, and which ones we should start with. But I would probably stay away from that one as a first one, not just because it can get a little personal, but as you're going to see, it's going to take a lot of data to get that. And so you're better off starting where you can get the greatest amount of data that's the most accurate, that gives you some indication of performance of your program, and then use that as a target. That becomes the area that you want to focus on. And I think that's the best way to do it. People will rally if you just say, I want to improve turnover time. It's like, okay, great. What's our turnover time? Well, it's 12 minutes. Like, well, 12 minutes is pretty good. But if you come back and say, well, our turnover time is, an hour and 25 minutes on average, I go, wow, that's pretty awful. You're going to want to improve that. And only because I know compared to others that's a lot. But there it is. Here we have a baseline. We have a comparison to some benchmark out there, and we say, hey, maybe average in this area in this type of cases is 45 minutes. And so, okay, let's start there. That's we want to, we're at an hour and 25 minutes. We know we got to get down to 45 minutes if we want to be competitive in this area. So to me, that's more important, is identify where your areas of opportunity are. It's really difficult to improve on really outstanding. I was approached about this a few years ago, and it had to do with a certain type of surgical procedure, and they noticed some costs had gone up and wanted to standardize. They wanted to eliminate some supplies, and I went back and started looking at the data, and what I found was our outcomes, our complication rates were 0.7. That means, so this is a risk-adjusted benchmark outcome for complications. Observed to expected is a ratio of looking at what was observed versus what's expected compared to others in a benchmark fashion, risk-adjusted benchmark fashion across the country. So greater than 1 is worse, 1 is equal, and then less than 1 is good. And so we had 0.7, which in that particular category at the time we were looking at it was outstanding performance. And I said, something changed here when our surgeons started doing different things. I don't know exactly what it is, but we're getting absolutely outstanding results. Is that where we want to focus on? Is that an area that is really an area? And we were talking about fairly negligible costs for the type of procedure. And we were going to go in and basically tell them we're going to change we, on the administration side, we're going to tell the surgeons how they can improve their performance and decrease their costs. I think what the surgeons were telling us through the data was we've already figured out how to get the best performance out of this service line right now. And yeah, maybe there's some opportunity for cost reduction, but just walking in and wholesale saying we're going to, quote, improve your outcomes by decreasing your cost, I thought was really kind of a stretch. And not only that, but there were other areas that I thought were more important that we could be focusing on. And so keep that in mind. What level of the performance are you going to be going after? At some point you're going to have performance level on all of these, whether it's the surgeon level, the team level, the operating room as a whole, your med-surg unit. Like, for example, we're talking about enhanced recovery programs. Is your med-surg unit, are they implementing your post-operative protocols the way you want them to? The facility, how are you as an organization at that level doing? And then if you're involved in a system level work, how are you as a system doing? Are there some that are outstanding and some that aren't so good? And then can you use that to improve performance? I'm a big believer in looking at the positive deviance. Find out the people who have identified the problem, figured out a way to resolve it and improve performance, and figure out how to scale that up, because that's a really great way of getting performance improvement. And someone else has already got the solution for you. They've done most of the work. You just got to figure out a way to scale it up and implement it. So find out what level of performance you're looking at. Categories to track, pretty basic. Utilization is basically throughput. You're going to be looking at capacity, volume, and variability. Those are the three drivers of throughput. I always think of like the traffic out on a freeway. There's only so many lanes. If you only have 3 lanes, or you're going to be able to hold 3 lanes worth of traffic. That's your capacity. The volume is the number of cars and trucks that are going in there. The variability is the variability in the size and how quickly or slowly vehicles are moving in that variability. If you have a car accident and cuts off 2 lanes, guess what? Huge variability. Now all of a sudden, not only that, but you've just impacted your capacity. You've dropped your 3 lanes down to 1 lane, and so what happens is the same volume is going to take longer to get through. And so when you're thinking about utilization, always think about in terms of what's our capacity, how can we either improve our capacity or improve our utilization with that capacity. Look at the volume that's coming through, and look at the variability. If you look at an OR schedule and you have 3 cases scheduled, and one is a robotic prostatectomy, the next one's a robotic ventral hernia repair, and the next one's a robotic pancreatic duodenectomy. wow, that's a lot of variability in for one day. And it's everything from, what robot are you going to use? Do you have an SI? Do you have an XI? How are you going to set up the room? You've got 3 different surgeons coming in and operating. Are they doing their cases in a like fashion? Do they have similar instrument trays? The cases are varied. They're probably all going to be significant in length. If you think you're going to be able to get through that schedule in an 8-hour day, you're hallucinating. It just isn't going to happen. So think about that when you're tracking utilization. What kind of cases are you doing? Or what's the average time of your case? If the average time of your case is an hour and a half and 2 hours, man, you can crank a lot of volume through that, assuming you just have your robotic room set up for 8 hours a day. On the other hand, if you're doing a lot of oncology and you're waiting around for pathology to come back and things like that, and typical OR time is about 5 hours on average, man, you're going to have trouble. You're not going to be able to get 2 cases in an average day, mainly because if you only have 8 hours a day, you're not going to add on that second case because you're going to go over. So that'll probably get filled with a non-robotic case. Remember, that gets back to the perioperative director. You got to understand how they're being incentivized. And so it's not real complicated, but it's somewhat complicated. And you have to understand that these are things that are driving your program and the success of your program. You may not even know it. You may only be going in there and operating and doing your robotic hernia repairs or something like that, or your robotic colectomies, but everybody else is doing something else, or your robotic hysterectomies. You're thinking, how come everybody else can't work this fast, and how come they can't move through? And well, if you're only doing benign hysterectomies, maybe that's the reason. They're not dealing with the kind of cases you have. And so that variability is going to be important, and you just have to remember that you're going to be managing variability. It generally tends to be a bigger issue than people give it credit for. Cost is going to become an issue. You'll see over time that cost is something that you can track and that you can improve with time. When you start up a program, they tend to be much costlier. Why? Because people are trying different instruments, they're trying new ways of doing things, and it just adds OR time. Maybe they're even learning how to use the robot for the first time. It's going to add time. It's going to crank up your cost. And so that should smooth out over time on its own. Now, if you do it intentionally, though, you can get it to drop faster in a quicker fashion. So you have to keep that in mind. Quality takes a lot of data to generate quality data. It really does. It's not something you can't have a couple cases. There isn't a surgeon in the world who's going to look at, my last 5 cases and say, you're going to give me data on my quality, really, on 5 cases. That N is too low. I don't trust the data. And they're going to be right. You're going to need a lot more data to be able to truly track quality, depending on which level of that you're looking at within your metrics. So if you're tracking at a system level and you now have 400 cases, yeah, you can start looking at quality. But if you're just tracking at individual level, like a surgeon level, and your average surgeon's only doing 1 case a month, it's going to take you a long time to generate some data on quality for them. Patient experience, I think this is important to track. You need to keep an eye on it. If there's a way to set this up with your vendor who tracks your patient experience, by all means do it. You want to get a sense of do they appreciate it more than they do other types of operative approaches. Patients at least seem to appreciate it more, but whether they actually do or not remains to be seen. They certainly appreciate minimally invasive approaches more, but whether a robotic experience is truly enhancing their overall experience at the hospital or not, I think remains to be tested. So I think it's a good one. And I also think following your surgeon and team experience. Remember, one of the things robotics does is it definitely helps the teams in terms of ergonomics. So, get a sense of whether they're benefiting from it and are aware that they're benefiting from it. I think most people sort of intuitively look at the benefits of using robotics from a health standpoint, but I don't think that we necessarily go out and actually sample and survey people to ask them what they think of it, how it's working for them in their practice. So it's good to get that feedback, even if it's anecdotal feedback. I think you should be aware of it. So I call it the metrics progression, and what I mean by that is I alluded to it earlier, and that is you're going to need a certain amount of volume. So when you first start out a program, look at your volume data. Why? Because you can't do a whole lot else without volume. You really can't look at utilization until you get a sufficient amount of volume to be able to look at it. And you're certainly not going to get any statistically significant results until you have some volume behind it. And not only that, but volume generates experience. Experience generates improvements in utilization. And so you should be able to track that over time when you get a sufficient volume. And that is, where were we before and where are we at now? Maybe before our turnover time was, 48 minutes, but hey, now that we're up and cruising, we chop that turnover time down to, 27 minutes. That's just purely from experience. And so that's the type of thing that you want to be looking at. It's also going to take a little while to generate costs. This is probably something you might think, well, we can generate cost data right now. It's like, yeah, but you're not going to be able to get a lot of financial data. Remember, by the time they send the bill out, by the time they get, work through all the denials process and all that stuff that modern hospitals have to deal with, by the time they get paid for that procedure, you're not really going to generate. You're not going to generate any margin data on this, and you might be able to get some cost data fairly early on, but not without some significant amount of volume. So you're probably going to have to start with volume. I usually tell people move on to utilization because that's going to be the next big ticket item, and then start looking at cost. I would save quality until last, and the reason is because you need a sufficient volume to feel confident in your quality data. And your surgeons, if you try to go into them after the first month and say, wow, our quality's awful, our observed to expected is 2.2, it's really bad, and you guys need to improve. And it's like, that you could have one or two cases that blow that out of the water. And, 8 months from now, you might be looking at your data again, and all of a sudden you realize that, wow, with time and volume, that actually evened out, and actually you're looking pretty good. So I would hold off on quality, not because it's not important, but because you need a sufficient amount of volume in order to generate accurate quality data. So you may as well start with something that's right in front of you first, and then progressively move towards these other types of data. So here's an example. I just throw this out there. I've mentioned this before, and that is I have a robotics startup kit. You can contact me at my email, and you'll see the email address at the end of this. But and it has 10 items in it. I also have a read first document that shows you how to use each of the items in the startup kit. But this is one of them that I have in there. Also, it's a little bit more built out in the startup kit, but it's a robotics program dashboard. It's just simply looking at how to look at a dashboard and try to keep it simple. Look at your annual, your prior year, look at percent changes and what was your targets for that year. And you're seeing here in the green and red, those are the targets that they set for their facility. And you can see, they got most of their targets, but there are a few they fell off on, but they're still working on it. So it's just kind of it's a nice way to be able to track things, look at it pretty straightforward, and you just say, okay, did we meet our volume? Yeah, we met our volume target. Okay, we wanted, in this particular one, they wanted to increase their general surgery volume, and you can see they wanted to increase by 50%. And, I think that's the thing to remember is that you have to have a plan behind all of these. Each one of them is specifically coming with a plan that supports the numbers that you see on the dashboard. So I mentioned it before, there's supporting material. The robotics program startup kit, you just send me an email, and I'll show you my email here in a second, or you can just go to my website. And if you do that, you can. I'll send you back a robotics program startup kit. It has 10 items that I think that most people would find helpful for starting up a program. I also include a read this first document, which kind of walks you through each of the documents and how you can use it to help you start up your program. This robotics startup kit is for free. It's just send me an email. I'll put you on my newsletter list, and that way you can get updates on what's happening with other things that I'm working on. I also have a robotics program books, the print edition, EPUB. Print edition, you can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Lulu.com and order those up. Barnes & Noble and Amazon, I think there's several other large distributors of books out there that also carry the EPUB version. So if you're an EPUB kind of person, you'll get it for a much lower cost, and you'll be able to look at it electronically. I also sponsor mentorship programs for physician leaders, and that is just literally walking people through. That one does have some costs associated with it. That's always negotiable, but it's a program designed specifically for physician leaders who are starting up a robotics program and want a little bit more help than what either this program did or the books or the startup kits will provide. And I also have available other programs. I have 2 other books. One of them is on the value analysis program. The other is on the clinical practice program. This is my advice, which is if you're looking at those going, oh, maybe I'll check out those books or something like that. I'm all for it. Obviously, I wrote them. I believe in them. But I really believe that if you get one of these programs and you get it up and running at your hospital, you will become an expert. You probably won't need to read an additional book to show you how to do it. Because what happens is that you learn the skill set. And that skill set is transferable to other types of programs. So everything I teach in robotics is the same stuff I teach in value analysis. It's just very specific for a value analysis program. And it's the same thing with clinical practice program. Yeah, there's some selective things that you can learn in that as well. But I personally think that if you do it in one program, you should be able to transfer that knowledge to another program. So there's also other supporting material and other courses available. I'll continue to add courses, continue to add supporting material. Some of it's for free, some of it's not for free, but you can go in and pick and choose what you'd like. Feel free to send me an email and let me know what you think about all the programs or any of the materials that you end up using. And like before, any questions, please contact me, Terry Loftus, MD, at gmail.com, or you can go to my website, www.loftushealth.com, and get more information. And you can also get updates. And feel free to sign up for my newsletter. If you do, I'll send you regular updates, and you'll get to know when I'm blogging, when I'm putting posts out on LinkedIn, when I'm writing new material, when I'm putting out new courses, if I'm giving talks somewhere, things like that. So it's really, I think, a nice way to keep in touch, and I would love to hear any comments or questions you have, so feel free to connect with me, and I hope you enjoyed this program. I really want you to go out there and be successful. If you're successful, I'm successful. That's pretty much how I look at it, and that is, I want you to be able to implement this type of program and walk away going, yep, I was able to develop a successful robotics program, and not only that, but I feel like I have a skill set that if I walked into another hospital somewhere else in the country, that I'd be able to do the exact same thing. And I think that's what I really want to see, is I want you to be able to take this with you for the rest of your career, and I want to obviously develop the program over time to make it even better. So feel free to contact me and give me some advice on how I can make the program better. And that's it for today. And like I said, enjoy what you're doing. It really is. Like I said, I'm getting to this point in my life where, I realize that every moment I live is just, another day to really enjoy my time here on this planet. And hopefully my contribution to this is with this type of program development. And I'd like to see patients benefit from it, because that's ultimately where I'm coming from. So have a great day, and thank you very much. I appreciate your time, your attention, and your willingness to work your way through this program.